Welcome to Whispers and Footsteps, where quiet moments hide dangerous truths. If you love mysteries, driven by subtle clues and human secrets, you're exactly where you should be. Now, let the story begin. Poirot's Birthday Mystery, Chapter 1, A Quiet Birthday Morning. Hercule Poirot awoke earlier than usual on the morning of his birthday. The light entering through the narrow window of his flat was pale and restrained, as though the day itself wished to avoid unnecessary drama. Poirot lay still for a moment, listening. London had not yet fully stirred. No hurried footsteps on the pavement below, no raised voices, only the distant rhythm of a city breathing slowly into consciousness. Birthdays, Poirot reflected, were curious things. They did not announce themselves with truth. They pretended to celebrate life, yet quietly measured what had already slipped away. One grew older, not with noise, but with accumulation, of memories, of habits, of things left unsaid. He rose carefully, placing his slippers in perfect alignment beside the bed. Disorder, even at dawn, was unacceptable. Today especially, everything must begin correctly. At the washstand, Poirot examined his reflection with a seriousness usually reserved for interrogations. His moustache required attention beyond the ordinary. He combed, adjusted, and shaped it until the familiar symmetry returned. Only then did he permit himself a faint smile. Exactness, he murmured, is a form of respect, even toward oneself. He dressed slowly, selecting his clothes with deliberate care. Not his most formal suit, this was not a public celebration, but one that spoke of quiet dignity. A man, Poirot believed, should dress not for the occasion alone, but for the truth of the day. And today, though modest on the surface, carried an invisible weight. Breakfast was simple. Tea poured at the correct temperature, toast prepared precisely, neither rushed nor neglected. Poirot ate thoughtfully, his mind already turning inward. It was then that Captain Hastings arrived. As always, Hastings brought energy with him, as though he had borrowed it from the air itself. He greeted Poirot with enthusiasm, warm wishes, and a carefully wrapped parcel placed upon the table. "My dear Poirot," Hastings said, "many happy returns. I hope you're ready for a bit of celebration." Poirot inclined his head. "Happiness, my friend, is rarely something for which one prepares, but tell me, what sort of celebration?" Hastings explained that Mrs. Edith Berkeley, a widow of impeccable reputation and long-standing acquaintance, had insisted upon hosting a small gathering that evening. Nothing extravagant, a few guests, tea, cake, a polite acknowledgement of the day. She was quite determined, Hastings added, said birthdays should never pass unmarked. Poirot considered this. Mrs. Berkeley was known for her careful observance of social duties, a woman who believed deeply in propriety, in correct gestures made at correct times. Such people, Poirot knew, often hid much beneath their courtesy. "I accept," Poirot said at last. "It would be ungracious to refuse." Hastings seemed relieved. He spoke a little more about the expected guests, though without detail. Poirot listened with half an ear, his thoughts elsewhere. After Hastings departed, the flat seemed quieter than before. Poirot moved to the window and looked down at the street. A young couple passed, laughing softly. An elderly man paused to adjust his scarf, his movements careful, almost ceremonial. Life continued, indifferent to dates and anniversaries, yet Poirot felt it clearly. This birthday was different. Not because of age, not because of attention, but because of memory. There are days, Poirot knew, when the past becomes impatient, when things long buried begin to stir, not violently but insistently, like fingers tapping beneath a polished table. He picked up Hastings' parcel and set it aside unopened. Gifts, too, were best appreciated in their proper time. Later that morning, Poirot took a short walk. He preferred movement on such days, not haste, but measured motion. The city offered him its usual patterns: shopkeepers arranging displays, neighbors exchanging restrained greetings, the quiet choreography of ordinary lives. As he walked, Poirot thought of Mrs. Barclay. She was a woman of restraint, yes, but also of endurance. She had lived alone for many years, not unhappily, yet not untouched by absence. Poirot had always sensed something unresolved in her manner, something gently folded away and never reopened. People like Mrs. Barclay did not forget. They remembered carefully. By midday, Poirot returned home. He read for a time, though the words did not fully claim his attention. His thoughts returned again and again to the evening ahead. A birthday gathering should have been harmless, pleasant even, and yet Poirot had learned to trust the quiet warnings of his mind. They rarely announced themselves loudly. They appeared instead as discomfort without cause, as questions without form. That afternoon, he prepared himself with extra care. He polished his shoes until they reflected light cleanly. He selected gloves appropriate to the season. Everything was correct. As he stood ready to leave, Poirot paused. He looked once more around the room. His home was orderly, familiar, comforting. Outside, the world waited. A birthday, he said softly to himself, is a pause between what has been and what remains. It invites reflection, but also revelation. He took his hat and stepped out, locking the door behind him with a decisive click. The day had begun quietly, but Poirot knew, with the certainty born of long experience, that silence was rarely empty. Sometimes it was only gathering itself. Chapter 2, The Drawing Room of Unspoken Things. Mrs. Edith Barclay's house stood on a quiet street where respectability seemed to have settled decades earlier and refused to move on. Its brick facade was modest, its windows narrow and carefully kept, its front door polished to a restrained shine. Nothing about the place invited curiosity, yet nothing discouraged attention either. It was the sort of house that suggested everything important happened inside, and only to those who already knew how to look. Poirot arrived precisely on time. He rang the bell once, never twice, and waited. From within came the faint sound of measured footsteps. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Barclay herself, neatly dressed in a soft blue gown that matched her composed expression. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," she said warmly. "How kind of you to come." "Madame," Poirot replied, bowing slightly. "On a birthday, kindness travels both ways." She smiled at that, though something in her eyes flickered briefly, an emotion too quick to be named. Then she stepped aside and allowed him to enter. The drawing room was already prepared. Curtains half drawn to soften the daylight, chairs arranged with careful symmetry, the small table at the center laid with china that was elegant without being ostentatious. Everything had been planned to appear effortless. At the heart of the room stood the cake. It was white, simple in design, with delicate piping around the edges and silver sugar beads that caught the light when one moved. The candles were evenly spaced, straight as soldiers at attention. Poirot noted, without appearing to do so, the silver cake knife resting nearby on a folded cloth. Its handle gleamed. Captain Hastings arrived moments later, full of cheer, and soon after the remaining guests followed. Sir Lionel Kemp entered first, his presence announced by a hearty voice and confident stride. He greeted Mrs. Barclay with exaggerated warmth, as though volume itself were proof of goodwill. Poirot observed him calmly. Men who filled rooms often did so to avoid listening to them. Mr. Alan Pierce followed, a contrast in every way. Tall, restrained, his movements careful, his speech economical. He offered polite greetings, his eyes lingering briefly on Mrs. Barclay, before moving away. Then Mrs. Mabel Green arrived, bustling and eager, bringing with her the faint scent of lavender and the unmistakable air of someone who enjoyed events precisely because they might later be discussed. Last of all came Miss Dora Kemp. She entered quietly, almost apologetically, and took a seat near the edge of the room. Her dress was plain but immaculate, her posture composed, her hands folded as though they had learned long ago not to reach for anything unnecessary. Poirot noticed her immediately. Not because she drew attention, but because she avoided it. As tea was poured and small courtesies exchanged, Poirot allowed himself the role of observer. He listened, nodded, smiled at the correct moments, yet his eyes missed nothing. Mrs. Barclay moved among her guests with ease, attentive but not effusive. She seemed genuinely pleased to host, though there was a carefulness to her movements, as if she were following a script rehearsed long ago. Conversation flowed politely. Sir Lionel spoke of local matters. Mrs. Green laughed too readily. Mr. Pierce answered questions briefly, thoughtfully. Miss Dora Kemp said very little. When she did speak, her voice was low and steady. She did not seek agreement, nor did she resist it. She existed within the room without attempting to shape it. Poirot found this interesting. People who had nothing to prove often carried the heaviest histories. As the afternoon light shifted, Mrs. Barclay announced that the cake would be cut shortly. There was mild applause, the sort offered out of politeness rather than excitement. Poirot watched Mrs. Barclay carefully then. For a moment, only a moment, her gaze rested on Dora Kemp. There was no hostility in it. No accusation, merely recognition. Something unspoken passed between them. Poirot felt it like a change in temperature. He had seen such looks before. They did not belong to enemies. They belonged to people bound by something long finished and yet never resolved. Mrs. Barclay turned away quickly, smoothing her dress, resuming her hostess's smile. Dora lowered her eyes. The cake knife was brought forward and placed closer to the table's edge. Mrs. Green offered to help, but Mrs. Barclay declined gently. "I will do it myself," she said. "It feels appropriate." Poirot noted the phrase. Appropriate for whom? As teacups were cleared and chairs adjusted, Poirot shifted slightly in his seat. He had not yet identified the nature of the tension in the room, but he recognized its shape. It was not new. It had simply been waiting for the right moment. Birthdays, he thought again, had a way of summoning ghosts. Mrs. Barclay lifted her gaze and smiled toward Poirot. "My dear Monsieur Poirot," she said, "before we begin, may I say how pleased I am that you are here today?" "I am honored, madame," Poirot replied sincerely. She hesitated, just slightly, as though she wished to add something more. Her lips parted, then closed again. Dora Kemp's hands tightened in her lap. Poirot saw it. He understood then that this gathering was not merely a courtesy. It was a convergence, a moment chosen, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps not, when the past and present had been invited into the same room. Mrs. Barclay reached for the silver knife. The light from the window caught its handle, sending a brief flash across the table. Poirot leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged. Something had arrived, and whatever it was, it had been patient for a very long time. Chapter 3. Death Between Celebration and Silence. Mrs. Edith Barclay's fingers closed around the handle of the silver cake knife. It was a small movement, neat and unremarkable, performed with the ease of habit. She had cut countless cakes in her lifetime, at teas, birthdays, farewells, and quiet anniversaries that meant something only to her. There was nothing ceremonial in the gesture, only familiarity. "Now then," she said lightly, her voice carrying the careful warmth of a practiced hostess, "before the tea grows cold." She angled the knife toward the cake, its polished surface catching the afternoon light. For a fraction of a second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Even the chatter faded, as though everyone instinctively understood that a pause was required. The blade touched the icing. Mrs. Barclay did not cry out. There was no dramatic gasp, no flung arm, no theatrical collapse. Instead, her body reacted first, as if some invisible signal had been sent inward. Her hand stiffened. The colour drained from her face with astonishing speed. Her eyes widened, not in fear, but in surprise, as though she had suddenly recognized something she had not expected to meet again. The knife slipped from her fingers. It struck the table edge with a faint metallic sound before falling to the carpet. One of the candles trembled, its flame bending sharply, then straightening again. Mrs. Barclay swayed. For a heartbeat, it seemed she might recover her balance. Her free hand moved slightly, reaching, not toward the table, but inward, toward her chest. Then her knees buckled. She fell heavily to the floor, the sound of her body striking the rug far louder than the knife had been. Silence followed, not the comfortable silence of polite company, but the shocked stillness that arrives when the world has altered itself without warning. No one moved, no one spoke. Even Sir Lionel Kemp, who rarely paused for breath, stood frozen, his mouth half open. Poirot was the first to act. He rose from his chair at once, moving with surprising speed for a man of his build. He knelt beside Mrs. Barclay, his movements precise, economical, stripped of ceremony. He did not touch her immediately. He looked. Her eyes were open, staring not at the ceiling, but at nothing at all. Her lips were slightly parted, as though a final word had been prepared but never spoken. Poirot reached for her wrist. There was no pulse. He straightened slowly. "She is dead," he said quietly. Mrs. Mabel Green let out a thin, startled cry and pressed a hand to her mouth. Mr. Pierce stepped back instinctively, knocking lightly against a chair. Sir Lionel muttered something under his breath, an oath, perhaps, or a prayer. Only Dora Kemp remained completely still. Her hands were clenched now, white at the knuckles, resting rigidly in her lap. She did not scream. She did not rush forward. Her gaze was fixed on Mrs. Barclay's body, unwavering, unreadable. Poirot noticed this. "Captain Hastings," Poirot said calmly, "please see that no one leaves the room." Hastings nodded at once, shaken, but obedient. Poirot turned back to the table. The cake stood untouched, its smooth surface unbroken save for the faintest mark where the knife had brushed against it. The candles still burned, their flames steady now, casting soft light across the white icing. A birthday cake, Poirot thought, should never witness death. He looked down at the fallen knife. It lay on the carpet, gleaming innocently, its blade spotless, its handle reflecting the room's muted colors. No blood, no stain, nothing obvious. Yet a woman was dead. "Madame Barclay was well a moment ago," Sir Lionel said heavily. "She was laughing." "People often are," Poirot replied, "until they are not." He bent closer to Mrs. Barclay's face, studying it with careful attention. There was no sign of struggle, no distortion of features. Her expression was calm, almost resigned. Poirot had seen this before. "Poison," he murmured. Mrs. Green gasped. "Poison? But how?" Poirot did not answer immediately. He stood, brushing his hands together lightly, and looked around the room. Nothing appeared disturbed. Cups remained neatly placed. Chairs were still in their proper positions. The atmosphere of order remained intact, as though death itself had been unwilling to cause disorder. The room seemed to contract, the walls drawing a fraction closer. Poirot placed the knife carefully on the table and stepped back. He looked at each guest in turn, not accusingly, but attentively. Sir Lionel's face was flushed, his discomfort obvious and unguarded. Mr. Pearce stood stiffly, his jaw set, eyes lowered in thought. Mrs. Green trembled openly, her distress genuine. Dora Kemp remained composed. Poirot studied her longer this time. She had not moved since Mrs. Barclay fell. Her gaze had not wandered. Her breathing was shallow, controlled. Grief, Poirot knew, took many forms. Shock could paralyze, but this stillness was something else. It was restraint. Poirot looked again at Mrs. Barclay's body, a woman of habit, of ritual, of carefully managed appearances. He imagined her earlier that day arranging chairs, aligning candles, choosing words she might later speak, words she would now never say. The thought lingered with him. "Captain Hastings," Poirot said, "please send for a doctor and the police." Hastings nodded and moved toward the door. As the sound of his footsteps faded, Poirot turned back to the cake. One candle caught his attention. It was shorter than the others, not by much, but enough. He leaned closer. The wax had pooled more heavily at its base. It had burned longer, earlier. Poirot straightened slowly. In that small detail, something began to take shape. Not the whole truth, not yet, but the outline of intention. This death had not been spontaneous. It had not been provoked by sudden emotion or careless action. It had been waiting for a hand to close around a familiar object. Waiting for a moment that would appear ordinary. Waiting for a birthday. Poirot looked around the room once more. "Madame," he said softly to the still figure on the floor, "you chose the wrong day to remember." Outside, a distant sound of traffic drifted faintly through the window, reminding them all that the world continued, unaware and unconcerned. Inside the drawing room, time had stopped, and something long buried had finally risen to the surface. Chapter 4. The Quiet Language of Objects. The doctor arrived within 20 minutes, bringing with him the faint scent of disinfectant and professional detachment. He examined Mrs. Edith Barclay carefully, his movements respectful, his expression grave. "Death was swift," he said at last. "Almost instantaneous. I can see no sign of physical injury. Poison is the most likely cause." Poirot listened without interruption. He had already reached the same conclusion, but confirmation mattered. Facts, like emotions, required proper acknowledgement. "Can you estimate when it was administered?" Poirot asked. The doctor shook his head. "Only that it must have entered the body moments before death. The reaction was immediate." Poirot nodded. "Immediate, but not accidental." Inspector Lane arrived shortly after, bringing with him the weight of authority and the disruption of routine. He surveyed the room, took in the untouched cake, the fallen knife, the still form on the floor. "A birthday party," he said quietly. "Not the place one expects this." "Expectations," Poirot replied, "are often the first things to be misled." The inspector's gaze settled on the cake. "Naturally, we'll begin there." Poirot raised a hand gently. "If you will allow me, Inspector, I believe we should begin elsewhere." Lane glanced at him, hesitated, then nodded. He had learned, through experience if nothing else, that Poirot's instincts were rarely misplaced. The cake was examined first, nonetheless, for form's sake. The icing was scraped, a portion removed for testing. Poirot observed without comment. He already knew what the results would show. "It is untouched," he said calmly. "And it must remain so." Lane frowned. "Why are you so certain the poison isn't in the cake?" "Because," Poirot replied, "Madame Barclay intended to serve it to everyone. Poison placed there would risk many lives. This crime sought only one." The inspector turned his attention to the knife. Poirot watched him closely now. The knife was lifted carefully, sealed, examined under the light. Clean. No visible residue. "Silver," Poirot said, "a material that remembers what touches it." Lane raised an eyebrow. "You suggest the poison was on the handle?" "Yes, applied deliberately, designed to act only when warmed by the human hand." Lane was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "A calculated method." Poirot's eyes drifted back to the candles. "Inspector," he said, "how long would you say those candles have been burning?" Lane glanced. "Since shortly before the incident, I imagine." Poirot pointed gently. "All but one." The inspector leaned closer. One candle was visibly shorter, its wax pooled thickly at the base. "This one was lit earlier," Poirot said. "Not by much, just enough." "Enough for what?" "For preparation." The inspector straightened. "You're saying someone lit it early to warm the knife handle?" "Precisely," Poirot replied. "Heat awakens certain substances. The poison remained dormant until the moment Madame Barclay touched the knife." Lane exhaled slowly. "That narrows things." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "To those who knew when the cake would be cut and ensured they were nearby beforehand." The inspector's eyes moved around the room. The guests remained seated, subdued, each absorbed in private thought. Mrs. Mabel Green clutched her handkerchief, her distress loud and unguarded. Sir Lionel paced near the fireplace, his movements heavy, uneven. Mr. Pierce stood near the window, staring outward as though distance might offer clarity. Miss Dora Kemp sat exactly where she had been before. She had not moved. Poirot approached her slowly, not to accuse, not yet, but to observe. "Miss Kemp," he said gently, "may I ask you something?" She looked up at once. Her eyes were clear, dry, controlled. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. Did you notice anything unusual before Madame Barclay collapsed?" She considered the question. "No, nothing." Her answer was calm, immediate, too immediate. Poirot inclined his head and moved away without comment. He returned to the table, studying the arrangement again. Cups placed evenly, chairs aligned, everything bore the imprint of Mrs. Barclay's careful nature. "A woman of habit," Poirot murmured. "Habits created predictability. Predictability created opportunity." He imagined the moments before the guests arrived, the quiet house, the cake prepared, the knife polished, the candles waiting. Someone had been alone here. Someone had known. Poirot addressed the room. "This was not an impulsive act," he said. "It required time, patience, and emotional restraint." Sir Lionel stopped pacing. "You're saying someone planned this calmly at a birthday?" Poirot met his gaze. "Especially at a birthday? Because birthdays disarmed suspicion, because they carried an expectation of kindness, because no one looked closely at objects meant to celebrate." Inspector Lane nodded slowly. "Then the motive must be strong." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "But not necessarily obvious." The inspector asked questions, where each guest had been earlier, who had arrived first, who had access to the room. Poirot listened, storing each answer carefully. Mrs. Green had arrived early to help, as she often did. Sir Lionel had come later than planned. Mr. Pierce had arrived precisely on time. Dora Kemp had been among the first. Poirot noted this, but did not yet draw conclusions. As the body was prepared to be removed, Poirot paused beside it once more. He looked down at Mrs. Barclay's face. There was no fear there, only recognition. She had known something in her final second, something familiar, something personal. Poirot straightened. This, he said quietly to himself, was not a death inflicted by hatred. Hatred left marks, violence, disorder. This death had been neat, contained, almost tender. He turned back to the inspector. When you search for the reason, Inspector, do not look for gain. Look for memory. Lane studied him. Memory? Yes, Poirot said, the kind that refuses to remain silent. Outside, evening light began to fade. The birthday candles were extinguished at last, their smoke rising faintly, then vanishing. The celebration had ended, but the past, long restrained, had finally spoken, and Poirot knew that when it did, it never spoke without consequence. Chapter 5. A Love That Learned to Be Silent. The house grew quieter as evening settled in, not with comfort, but with weight. The cheerful expectation that had once filled Mrs. Barclay's drawing room had drained away, leaving behind a stillness that pressed upon the walls. Lamps were lit one by one, their soft glow unable to banish the sense that something unfinished lingered in the air. Poirot remained. While Inspector Lane continued his formal inquiries with the others, Poirot withdrew slightly from the centre of activity. He preferred, in moments like these, not to interrogate, but to listen, to the atmosphere, to the pauses between words, to what was not being said. It was then that he asked to speak with Miss Dora Kemp. She agreed at once. They sat together in the smaller sitting room at the back of the house. It was a quieter space, furnished plainly, as though meant for reflection rather than display. A single lamp stood between them, its light falling gently on Dora's face. She sat very straight, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed. Too composed, Poirot thought. Grief usually disturbed order. Dora's seemed to have reinforced it. "I am sorry to trouble you, Miss Kemp," Poirot said gently, "but I would like to understand you better." She inclined her head. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot did not begin with questions. Instead, he allowed silence to stretch between them. It was not an uncomfortable silence. Dora appeared well accustomed to it. Only when the quiet had settled fully did he speak again. "You have known Mrs. Barclay a long time," he said. "Yes," Dora replied, "most of my adult life." "And during that time," Poirot continued, "you lived here?" "Oh, for many years," she said calmly. "After my uncle's death, my aunt and I remained together." Poirot nodded. Two women sharing a home often share more than rooms. They share habits, histories, sometimes regrets. Dora's fingers tightened slightly, then relaxed again. The movement was small, but Poirot saw it. "She was kind to me," Dora said, "always." Poirot studied her face. "Kindness," he said softly, "does not always erase pain." Dora looked up then, meeting his eyes directly. There was no defiance in her gaze, only weariness. "You believe this concerns love," she said quietly. Poirot did not pretend surprise. "Yes." She drew a slow breath. "Then you already know more than most." Poirot leaned back slightly, giving her space. He had learned long ago that confessions, like memories, surfaced best when not forced. "There was a man," Dora said after a pause. "Long ago." Her voice was steady, but something in its tone suggested years of careful control. "I loved him," she continued, "not dramatically, not foolishly. I loved him the way one loves when one expects nothing in return." Poirot listened without interruption. "We were young," Dora went on. "I believed patience was a virtue. I believed that if I waited, if I did not demand, time would reward me." She gave a faint, humorless smile. It did not. Poirot said nothing. Silence, he knew, was Dora's native language. Edith Barclay entered his life later, Dora said. She was different from me. She spoke freely. She laughed without caution. She wanted things and took them. Her hands folded more tightly now. She did not steal him, Dora said quickly, almost defensively. He chose her. That is important. I never blamed her for that. Poirot understood now why Dora had not screamed when Mrs. Barclay fell, why her grief had been so controlled. This was not shock. This was the collapse of something long contained. Tonight, Poirot said, Mrs. Barclay intended to speak of him. Dora closed her eyes briefly. Yes. Only a memory, Poirot continued, only a name. For her, Dora said quietly. For me, it was everything. She opened her eyes again, and for the first time, emotion broke through her composure. You must understand, she said, I did not fear exposure. There was nothing to expose. I feared revival. I feared that what I had buried would be spoken aloud, made real again. Poirot nodded slowly. Some memories, he said, survive only because they remain unnamed. Dora's voice dropped. If she had spoken his name, I would have lost him all over again. The room seemed to contract around them. You loved him still? Poirot said. Yes, Dora replied simply. In the way one loves something that has shaped one's entire life. Poirot rose slowly from his chair. And when love becomes the guardian of silence, he said, it sometimes commits unforgivable acts. Dora did not deny it. When Poirot returned to the drawing room, Inspector Lane looked at him expectantly. You have something? The inspector said. Poirot nodded. Yes, but it is not yet complete. He glanced toward the hallway where Mrs. Barclay's body had been removed. This crime, Poirot said quietly, was not born of anger, it was born of preservation. Inspector Lane frowned. Preservation? Of a memory, Poirot replied. Of a love that survived only because it was never spoken aloud. He looked back at the candle stubs on the table, now cold and lifeless. Some people kill to gain, Poirot continued. Others kill to prevent loss. He knew now where the truth lay. But knowing the heart of a crime was not the same as proving it. And Dora Kemp's love, silent for so long, had left almost no trace at all. Chapter 6. The day love refused to stay buried. Night had settled fully over Mrs. Barclay's house, bringing with it a stillness that felt heavier than darkness itself. The lamps glowed softly, casting long shadows along the walls, but nothing about the room felt warm anymore. The house no longer belonged to the living moment, it belonged to memory. Inspector Lane continued his methodical work, moving from guest to guest, collecting statements, confirming times and movements. His questions were practical, direct, and unemotional. Poirot listened not to the words themselves, but to how they were spoken, and to what each speaker carefully avoided. Sir Lionel Kemp recounted his arrival with clumsy honesty, irritation creeping into his voice whenever the subject lingered too long. Mr. Pierce spoke with measured restraint, answering precisely what was asked, and nothing more. Mrs. Mabel Green wept openly, her distress overflowing, unfiltered, genuine. Dora Kemp alone remained unchanged. She sat quietly, her posture impeccable, her expression calm, as though she had stepped outside herself and left her emotions elsewhere. Poirot had seen this before. It was not strength, it was endurance. As Inspector Lane stepped aside to review his notes, Poirot approached the window. Outside, the street lay silent, lamplight reflecting faintly on damp pavement. Somewhere beyond the quiet houses, life continued untroubled. Inside, time had folded in on itself. Poirot turned back to the inspector. "May I ask, Inspector, have you considered what Madame Barclay intended to say before she died?" Lane frowned slightly. Say? Yes, Poirot replied. Not do say. Lane hesitated. We assumed she was about to cut the cake. Indeed, Poirot said gently, but before that, he gestured toward the table. She addressed the room. She spoke to me. There was a hesitation, a pause. Lane considered this. You think her words matter? Very much, Poirot said, because words are often more dangerous than actions. Poirot moved slowly around the room, retracing the final moments in his mind. He stopped where Mrs. Barclay had stood, near the table, close enough to the guests that her voice would have reached everyone. She was about to remember, Poirot said quietly. Remember what? Lane asked. Someone, Poirot replied. The inspector looked unconvinced, but he listened. She had lived for years with restraint, Poirot continued. A woman like Madame Barclay does not speak carelessly. If she hesitated, it was because she had decided at last to say something she had long withheld. Lane folded his arms. And you believe that decision cost her life? Yes, Poirot said, because someone else could not bear to hear it. They both looked toward Dora Kemp. She sat in the same place, her hands folded, her gaze lowered. Inspector Lane sighed. I'll need more than intuition, Monsieur Poirot. Of course, Poirot replied calmly. Let us then look at actions. He turned back to the candles. Who lit them? Poirot asked. Mrs. Green dabbed her eyes. I did, or rather, I helped. Mrs. Barclay asked me to fetch the matches, but she lit them herself. Poirot nodded. And all at once? Yes. Poirot's eyes flicked briefly to Dora. And before the guests arrived? Poirot asked. Mrs. Green thought. No, I arrived early, but the candles were not lit then. Poirot inclined his head. Thank you. He turned to Dora Kemp. Miss Kemp, you arrived early as well, did you not? Yes, Dora replied evenly. How long before the others? Perhaps 20 minutes. Poirot nodded again. And during that time? I sat here, Dora said. I spoke with my aunt. Poirot's voice softened. About the past? Dora's gaze lifted slowly. Yes, she said. Briefly. Inspector Lane looked sharply at Poirot. She knew, Poirot continued gently, that tonight was different. Birthdays give people permission to look back, to speak freely, to unburden themselves. He walked a little closer to Dora now. You knew she was about to say his name? Dora did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was very quiet. She mentioned him earlier in the afternoon. Poirot nodded. And you asked her not to? I did not need to, Dora said. She promised nothing. But you understood, Poirot said. She was ready. Dora closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, something had shifted. The composure remained, but it was thinning. I could not lose him again, she said softly. Inspector Lane stiffened. Lose whom? The memory, Dora replied. The version of him that belonged only to me. Poirot felt the truth settle firmly now. He addressed the inspector. This was not about jealousy of Madame Barclay. It was about fear of resurrection. Love that survives only because it is silent cannot endure being spoken aloud. Lane shook his head slowly. You're saying she killed to keep a memory intact? Yes, Poirot said. Because once spoken, it would no longer be hers alone. He turned back to Dora. You lit the candle early, Poirot said gently. Just long enough. You warmed the handle. You knew the knife would be used immediately. Dora's lips trembled, but she did not interrupt. You did not plan this long in advance, Poirot continued. But once you knew she would speak, you decided. The room was utterly silent. I did not hate her, Dora said at last. I loved her. Poirot inclined his head. That is why this is tragedy. Inspector Lane exhaled slowly. "We'll need a full confession." Dora nodded faintly. "I will give it." Poirot stepped back. Love, he reflected, was capable of extraordinary patience, but when forced into the light, after too many years in darkness, it could become something unrecognizable, and tonight love had refused to stay buried. Chapter 7. Poirot speaks of the heart. Inspector Lane requested that everyone return to the drawing room. The space looked different now. Chairs had been moved, cups cleared away, the birthday table stripped of its earlier purpose. The cake still sat there, untouched, its white surface now faintly dulled by time and shadow. The candles had burned down to stubs, their promise exhausted. Poirot stood near the fireplace, his hands folded lightly before him. He waited until the room settled into silence, not the awkward kind, but the attentive one that precedes understanding. "Inspector," he said calmly, "with your permission, I believe it is time." Lane nodded. "Go on, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot turned first to the group as a whole. "This case," he began, "has never been about opportunity alone, nor has it been about anger, greed, or resentment. Those motives leave traces, rough edges, visible fractures in behavior. What we have seen here is different." He walked slowly toward the table, stopping beside the cake. "This," he said softly, "was meant to be a gentle evening, a birthday, a moment of remembrance, and it was precisely that intention which made the crime possible." Sir Lionel shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Green clasped her hands tighter. Mr. Pierce watched without blinking. Poirot continued. Madame Barclay was a woman of restraint, of careful decisions. She lived many years with something unresolved. Not a scandal, not a crime, but a memory she had chosen not to disturb. He paused. Tonight, she intended to disturb it. Dora Kemp's gaze remained lowered, but her shoulders had stiffened. Poirot approached her, not aggressively, but with quiet gravity. "You loved the same man," he said gently. There was no gasp, no denial. "Yes," Dora replied quietly. Poirot nodded. "You loved him first, and you loved him last." He turned back to the others. Years ago, both women were connected to the same man. He did not belong to either of them in the end. Life intervened. Time passed. But love, real love, does not always fade. Sometimes it simply learns how to be silent. Poirot lifted the silver knife from where it lay sealed on the sideboard. "The method was careful," he said. "Delicate, almost respectful. The poison was placed on the handle, not to cause spectacle, but to ensure certainty. It was dormant, harmless until warmed." He glanced toward the candles. One candle was lit earlier than the rest, only slightly, enough to prepare what needed preparing. When Madame Barclay touched the knife, the poison entered her system immediately. Inspector Lane nodded. "That much we understand." Poirot inclined his head. "But the reason is what matters." He faced Dora fully now. "You did not plan to kill your aunt when the day began," Poirot said. "You loved her, you lived with her, you respected her." Dora's voice was steady, though barely above a whisper. "Yes. But when you realized she intended to speak, when you understood that tonight she would say his name, you became afraid." Dora looked up at last. "I could not hear it," she said simply. "I could not bear to hear him become shared." Poirot nodded slowly. "For you," he said, "that love survived only because it remained unspoken. Once named, it would no longer belong to you alone. The memory would become public, changed." Tears welled in Dora's eyes, though none fell. "She meant no harm," Dora said. "She was not cruel. She simply did not understand." "No," Poirot agreed. "She did not." He turned back to the room. "This was not a murder driven by hatred," he said. It was driven by preservation, by fear of loss, not of a person, but of an inner world built over decades. Inspector Lane spoke quietly. "Miss Kemp, did you intend to kill her?" Dora was silent for a long moment, then she nodded. "Yes," she said. In that moment, Poirot spoke again, his voice softer now. "You acted not to gain something new," he said, "but to keep something old intact. You believed that by silencing her, you could preserve the past as it was." Dora's breath trembled. "I was wrong." "Yes," Poirot said gently. "You were?" He stepped back, allowing the inspector to approach. Inspector Lane cleared his throat. "Miss Dora Kemp, you are under arrest for the murder of Edith Barclay." Dora did not resist. She did not protest. She simply closed her eyes briefly, as though acknowledging an ending she had long expected. As the inspector signalled for assistance, Poirot remained where he was, looking not at Dora, but at the table. The cake was still there. Untouched. Perfect. "A birthday," Poirot said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, "is meant to honor life, but sometimes it invites the past to sit too close." He turned toward Hastings, who had watched everything in stunned silence. "This was not a clever crime," Poirot said. "It was a sorrowful one." Hastings nodded slowly. "She waited too long." "Yes," Poirot replied. "They all did." As Dora was led from the room, she paused once, just once, and looked back at the table. Not at the knife, not at the candles, at the cake. Then she walked on. Chapter 8. The Last Candle. The house emptied slowly, as though reluctant to release what it had been forced to hold. Inspector Lane and his officers departed with professional efficiency, their footsteps measured, their voices subdued. Mrs. Mabel Green left in tears, supported by Sir Lionel Kemp, whose earlier bluster had shrunk into a heavy, wordless fatigue. Mr. Pierce lingered only long enough to offer quiet condolences, then stepped out into the night, his silhouette swallowed by the darkness beyond the door. At last, only Poirot and Hastings remained. The drawing-room seemed larger now, stripped of people and purpose. The furniture stood where it had always stood, yet everything felt altered. Objects that once belonged to celebration now carried the weight of finality. The silver knife had been removed, the body long gone. Yet the room still remembered. Poirot stood very still, his gaze resting on the birthday cake. It remained untouched. The icing had lost its earlier sheen, the edges softening slightly as the room cooled. The candles, now reduced to wax stubs, leaned unevenly, as though exhausted by their brief responsibility. Hastings cleared his throat softly. "Shall I dispose of it?" Poirot did not answer at once. He stepped closer to the table and examined the cake as though it were an exhibit in a museum, something fragile, something misunderstood. "No," he said at last, "he will leave it." Hastings hesitated. "But—" "Tonight," Poirot continued gently, "it is no longer food, it is a witness." Hastings said nothing. Poirot reached out and one by one extinguished the remaining candles, though their flames had already died. He did it slowly, deliberately, as if marking an ending that required ceremony. "A birthday," he said quietly, "is meant to measure life, but sometimes it measures longing instead." Hastings watched him, troubled. "Do you believe she would have said the name?" "Truly?" "Yes," Poirot replied without hesitation. Madame Barclay had reached that age when silence begins to feel dishonest. She wished to remember openly, perhaps even to make peace with it. He sighed softly. But peace requires consent from all who are bound by the past. Dora Kemp was not ready. They moved to the sitting room, where earlier Poirot had spoken privately with Dora. The lamp was still lit, its glow subdued, its circle of light unchanged. The chairs stood as they had been left, facing one another. Poirot lowered himself into one of them. "Love," he said thoughtfully, "is patient. It waits, it adapts, but it does not forgive neglect easily." Hastings nodded. She loved him all her life. "Yes," Poirot said. "And because she never lived that love, it became the axis around which everything else turned. She built a world where it could exist safely, untouched, unchallenged." He paused. "When Madame Berkeley threatened that world, not intentionally but inevitably, Dora chose to protect it at any cost." Hastings frowned. "Even murder." "Especially murder," Poirot replied quietly. "For her, it was not destruction, it was preservation." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the house settle. Somewhere, a clock marked the passing of time with soft, indifferent ticks. At length, Hastings spoke again. "Do you think she regrets it?" Poirot considered the question carefully. "Regret," he said, "comes in layers. Dora Kemp regrets the consequence. She regrets the pain she caused. But the choice itself, made in that moment of fear, was true to who she had become." Hastings shook his head slowly. "All those years, and it ends like this." "Yes," Poirot said, "because when love is denied expression, it does not disappear. It waits. And waiting, my friend, changes things." They rose together and returned once more to the drawing room. Poirot took his hat from the sideboard and paused before leaving. His eyes moved briefly to the window, where faint reflections of lamplight shimmered against the glass. Outside, the street was quiet again. "A tragedy," Hastings said softly. Poirot nodded. "Not because someone died, though that is terrible enough, but because no one lived as they might have." He opened the door, then hesitated. "Remember this, Hastings," he said. "Crimes of passion are loud and clumsy. Crimes of love are quiet. They wear patience like a virtue." They stepped out into the night. Behind them, the house stood silent, holding within its walls a story that would never be told aloud again. The cake remained on the table, uncut. The candles, once lit in honor of life, were cold and shapeless. The birthday had passed, but the truth it summoned would endure, soft, sorrowful, and impossible to forget.
Hi everyone, so if you enjoy this video, share with your fellow mystery lovers and like this video. Thank you.